The year was 1884, and the world had worn Nathaniel Shaw down to a nub of a boy. At 14, he was made of little more than bone, gristle, and a silence so deep it seemed to have weight. He was an orphan, a stray scrap of humanity left behind by a cholera-swept wagon train 2 years prior, and the small, hard-scrabble settlement of Providence had taken him in with the same enthusiasm a dog accepts fleas. He was a mouth to feed, a pair of hands for the dirtiest work, and a constant, quiet reminder of the fragility that haunted them all on the vast, unforgiving plains of the Wyoming Territory. His existence was a circuit of thankless chores and cold corners. He mucked out the stables for a sour-faced blacksmith, swept the floor of the general store for a woman who counted out his payment in stale biscuits, and slept in a lean-to behind the saloon, where the wood was so rotten the wind sang a constant, mournful dirge through the walls. He had no memory of his mother's face, and only a fleeting image of his father's calloused hands. Loneliness was not an emotion to him. It was the weather, the air he breathed, the very firmament of his world. He watched families walk to the small clapboard church on Sundays, their hands linked, and felt a pang so sharp and familiar it was like an old injury aching with the cold. The people of Providence were not cruel by design but by necessity. Their lives were a constant battle against drought, dust, and despair. They had no room for softness, no space for a boy who belonged to no one. They saw his downcast eyes and his hunched shoulders and judged him as weak, another soul likely to be swallowed by the immense, indifferent land. They did not see the resilience coiled in his slight frame, the grit that allowed him to endure the casual unkindness and the gnawing emptiness without breaking. Nathaniel had learned that survival was not about being strong, but about being unnoticeable, about making himself so small the world might forget to crush him. That autumn, the sky was a vast, bleached blue, and the talk in Providence was of the buffalo. The great southern herd was moving, a dark, thundering river of life that was a promise of meat for the winter and hides for trade. A party of men from the settlement rode out to hunt, their departure a cloud of dust and boisterous confidence. Nathaniel was left behind, as always, tasked with fetching water and turning over the soil in a garden that was already surrendering to the coming frost. He was a mile from the settlement, near the cottonwoods that traced the shallow, winding creek, when he first felt it. It was not a sound, but a vibration, a deep, resonant tremor that traveled through the soles of his worn boots and up into the hollow of his chest. The ground itself seemed to be humming a low, ominous note. He straightened, his water bucket sloshing, and scanned the horizon. To the south, the endless sea of grass met the sky in a clean, sharp line, but the line was no longer clean. A darkness was spreading across it, a smudge of soot that grew and churned and resolved itself into a rolling cloud of dust. And then the sound came, a low rumble that grew into a deafening roar, the sound of 1,000 thunderstorms breaking at once. The buffalo. Not a hunting party's quarry, but the whole magnificent, terrifying herd, stampeding directly toward the creek, directly toward him. Fear, cold and absolute, seized him. He dropped the buckets and ran, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was not running toward the settlement, but along the creek, seeking the shelter of a shallow ravine he knew. As he scrambled over the rise, he saw Thema, small party of Cheyenne, caught as unaware as he was. They had been watering their horses. Now they were scattering, warriors leaping onto their ponies and racing away from the path of the living avalanche. But one did not move. An old man, his face a beautiful map of wrinkles and wisdom, his hair as white as winter snow. He had stumbled, his leg twisted beneath him, and he lay on the ground, his expression one of serene, fatalistic calm, as he watched death thunder toward him. The world narrowed for Nathaniel. The roar of the hooves, the shouts of the fleeing warriors, the frantic beating of his own heart, all faded into a dull hum. He saw only the old man, alone and vulnerable, and something inside him, a part he did not know he possessed, broke free from the cage of fear and solitude. It was an instinct deeper than self-preservation, a sudden, blinding refusal to let another person be swallowed by the indifferent world while he simply watched. He had been invisible his whole life. Now he would be a shield. He did not think. He simply acted. He ran, not away from the danger, but straight into its deafening heart. He reached the fallen elder just as the first wave of bison, a wall of shaggy muscle and wild eyes, was upon them. He threw his own small body over the old man's, curling himself into a ball, his arms wrapped around his head. He squeezed his eyes shut and braced for the impact. The first hoof struck his back like a blacksmith's hammer, driving the air from his lungs in a silent scream. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded through him, then another blow and another. It was not a series of impacts, but a single, continuous, crushing weight. The ground shook with a violence that rattled his teeth, the air thick with the smell of dust and sweat and animal fear. He felt a rib crack, a sharp, searing agony that lanced through his side. The world was noise and pressure, and a pain so immense it transcended feeling and became its own universe. He clung to consciousness by a thread, his only thought a mantra of grit. Hold on, hold on, hold on. Then, a final, devastating blow to his head sent him spiraling into a silent, starless black. The river of buffalo thundered over him, and the world went away. Consciousness returned not as a sudden awakening, but as a slow, painful tide seeping back into a barren shore. It came first as a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to fill his entire being, a universe of pain with him at its epicenter. Then came sounds, muffled and strange, a soft rustling, the crackle of a fire, and a low, rhythmic chanting in a language that felt like the earth itself given voice. He tried to open his eyes, but his lids were heavy, swollen things that refused to obey. He was lying on something soft, a bed of furs that smelled of smoke and sage. The air was warm, a stark contrast to the biting wind of his lean-to. A gentle hand touched his forehead, cool and dry. A different sensation followed, a wet cloth dabbing at his split lip, the taste of herbs and cool water, a balm on his parched tongue. He managed a groan, a sound that felt torn from the depths of his savaged body. Slowly, fighting through the fog of pain, he forced his eyes to open. At first, all was a blur of firelight and shadow, then shapes began to resolve. He was inside a lodge, the conical walls of hide, creating a warm, circular space. A small fire burned in the center, its smoke rising to an opening at the peak. And surrounding him, sitting in a silent, watchful circle, were 7 figures. They were young men, their faces cast in shadow and flickering light, their expressions unreadable. They had the high cheekbones and strong jaws of the Cheyenne, their black hair long and braided. They wore simple buckskin leggings and shirts, and their stillness was more intimidating than any threat. These were not the men from the settlement, with their loud voices and easy scorn. These men were carved from the plains themselves, their silence vast and deep. Fear, a cold and familiar companion, tried to rise in Nathaniel's throat, but it was too weak to fight the overwhelming pain. He tried to push himself up, but a fresh wave of agony shot through his back and chest, and he fell back with a gasp, his vision swimming. One of the figures, the one who seemed the oldest, his face stern and authoritative, made a small, sharp gesture with his hand. Another man, whose hands were stained with what looked like dried herbs, leaned forward. He spoke, his voice low and guttural, not to Nathaniel, but to the others. The words were meaningless to the boy, but the tone was one of sober assessment. This was Awoke, the healer, his touch both practiced and gentle as he examined the boy's wounds without causing him more pain than was necessary. Days bled into one another, a hazy continuum of pain, sleep, and waking moments of quiet observation. Nathaniel's world was the buffalo hide bed and the circle of 7 faces. He learned to distinguish them, not by name, but by their presence. There was the leader, Moketavato, whose gaze was heavy with responsibility and a deep, unyielding gravity. He rarely spoke, but when he did, the others listened. There was Honyahaka, the watcher, whose eyes missed nothing, his face a mask of intense, quiet scrutiny. He would sit for hours, simply observing Nathaniel's breathing, the flicker of his eyelids, as if trying to read the story written in his suffering. Wovoka was a constant presence, tending to his injuries with a skill that defied Nathaniel's understanding. He would grind herbs into pastes that soothed the burning of his abrasions and brew teas that dulled the sharp edges of his pain. He never smiled, but his hands were kind. Then there were the others. Akisto, broad-shouldered and powerful, a man who seemed to carry the strength of the bulls that had nearly killed the boy. Hotoa, leaner and more restless, who often paced the confines of the lodge like a caged wolf. Tavihon, whose face was open and less guarded than the others, his curiosity a palpable thing. And finally, Kohana, the youngest, who could not have been much older than Nathaniel himself. It was Kohana who first broke the wall of silent duty. One afternoon, when the pain was a low, manageable thrum, Kohana approached his bedside alone. He held out a small object in his palm. It was a piece of smoothed cottonwood, carved into the shape of a hawk, its wings outstretched. He placed it gently in Nathaniel's hand, his fingers briefly brushing the boy's. He said a single word, "Queso," his voice soft. He pointed to the carving, then to the sky visible through the smoke hole. Nathaniel understood. Hawk. It was the first bridge across the chasm of silence. He curled his fingers around the gift, the smooth wood, a small point of warmth in his vast sea of pain, and gave a weak, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. A flicker of something, not quite a smile, crossed Kohana's face before he retreated to his place. The 7 men were grandsons. He pieced this together from their interactions with the elder, Vokin, who now lay on his own bed of furs across the lodge. The old man was recovering, his leg bound in a splint, but his eyes were clear and sharp. He would watch Nathaniel for long periods, a complex mixture of gratitude, pity, and profound curiosity in his gaze. It was for him, Nathaniel now understood, that he had run into the path of the stampede, and it was his grandsons who now stood a silent, imposing vigil. Their care was methodical, born of a duty he could not yet comprehend. They brought him broth, spooning it carefully past his cracked lips. They kept the fire stoked, ensuring the warmth never left the lodge. They changed the poultices on his back and chest, where the bruises had blossomed into a horrific tapestry of black, blue, and purple. They did all this with a stoic detachment that was both comforting and unnerving. He was a charge, a responsibility, but he was not one of them. He was the white boy, the outsider, a puzzle they were tasked with keeping alive. The prejudice he had expected, the raw hatred spoken of in Providence, was absent. In its place was this solemn, watchful gravity, a weight of expectation he could feel but not name. Weeks passed. The raw, screaming pain in Nathaniel's body subsided into a deep, persistent ache. He could sit up now, propped against a backrest of willow and hide that Wovoka had fashioned for him. He spent his days watching the life of the camp through the open flap of the lodge. He saw women tanning hides, their hands moving with practiced grace. He saw children playing games with stones and sticks, their laughter a sound both alien and beautiful. He saw warriors returning from a hunt, their bearing proud and assured. It was a world complete and whole unto itself, a world that had no place for him, and yet here he was, at its very heart. He learned their names as he heard the elder, Vokin, speak them. He matched the names to the faces: Moketavato, the solemn leader; Honyahaka, the keen-eyed observer; Wovoka, the quiet healer; Akiseto, the strong bull; Hotoa, the restless hunter; Tavihon, the sun-shield; and Kohana, the swift, young one who had shown him the first glimmer of kindness. They were 7 parts of a single whole, bound to each other and to their grandfather by a loyalty as strong and unyielding as the land itself. The turning point came on a day when the autumn air had turned sharp with the promise of winter. Vulcan was strong enough to sit up and speak at length. He called his grandsons to him, and they gathered around his bed, their attention absolute. He gestured for Nathaniel to be brought closer. Akiseto and Tavehon lifted him, furs and all, with surprising gentleness, and placed him so he was part of the circle. The old man began to speak, his voice weak but clear, resonant with the authority of a lifetime. He spoke in the Cheyenne tongue, but his eyes were fixed on Nathaniel. He used his hands, painting pictures in the air, as he spoke of the hunt, the rumbling earth, the terror of the stampede. He described his fall, the brittle snap of his own bone, the certainty of his death, as he looked into the face of the charging herd. His grandsons listened, their faces stone, but a new tension entered the lodge. Then Vulcan's gaze softened, and he pointed a long, wrinkled finger at Nathaniel. He spoke of how the boy, a stranger, a child of the very people who were encroaching on their lands, had not run away. He described how Nathaniel had run toward him, how the boy's small, frail body had covered his own, becoming a living shield. He spoke of the impacts, the sound of the boy's bones breaking, the selfless courage that defied all reason. As he spoke, the atmosphere in the lodge shifted. The wall of stoic observation around the seven brothers began to crumble, replaced by something else, something akin to awe. For the first time, Nathaniel saw emotion crack their stoic facades. He saw it in the widening of Honyahaka's eyes, in the way Mokotavato's jaw tightened not with suspicion, but with a profound, troubled respect. He saw Wovoka look at the boy's healing wounds, not just as a medical challenge, but as a testament to the story his grandfather was telling. When the old man finished, a heavy silence descended. It was no longer the silence of suspicion, but one of deep, collective contemplation. Vulcan looked at each of his grandsons, his gaze lingering on them, before turning back to Nathaniel. He spoke again, his voice softer. Mokotavato was the first to move. He rose and came to Nathaniel's side. He looked down at the boy, and for the first time, Nathaniel did not feel like an object of scrutiny, but a person being truly seen. Mokotavato spoke, his voice a low rumble. He says, a new voice translated, startling Nathaniel. It was Honyahaka, the Watcher. His English was halting, heavily accented, but clear. He says, my grandfather, that your spirit is stronger than your bones. He says you have the heart of a warrior. Nathaniel could only stare, overwhelmed. He had never been called anything but a burden or a stray. To be called a warrior by these men, in this place, was a thing so far beyond his comprehension, it left him speechless. The ice was broken. From that day forward, the nature of his existence changed. The brothers no longer just cared for him. They began to connect with him. Honyahaka became his translator, patiently teaching him the Cheyenne words for fire, hoesta, water mape, and family, netsio. Wovoka, while tending his wounds, would now explain the properties of the herbs he was using, showing him the willow bark for pain and the yarrow to stop bleeding. Akisito and Hotoa would recount stories of their hunts, their gestures vivid and expressive, making him see the cunning of the wolf and the power of the bear. Tavehon, with his more open nature, would sit and simply talk, asking about the world of the white man with a genuine, non-judgmental curiosity. And Kohana continued to be his quiet friend, bringing him small gifts, a hawk feather, a polished river stone, a strip of sweet, dried berry jerky. Nathaniel, in turn, began to emerge from his own shell of silence. At first, his voice was rusty from disuse. He told them his name. He spoke of his own past, not as a plea for pity, but as a simple statement of fact. He had no parents, he had no family, he had no home. He spoke of the loneliness of Providence, the coldness of the people, the feeling of being invisible. As he spoke, he saw not pity in their eyes, but understanding. They, who were defined by their kinship, their intricate web of relations and responsibilities, seemed to understand the profound poverty of a life without it. His body healed, the broken ribs knitted together, leaving a permanent ache that flared with the cold. The deep bruises faded to yellowing shadows and then disappeared. He learned to walk again, his first halting steps supported by the strong arms of Moketavato and Akizeto. He limped, and Wovoka said he always would, a permanent reminder etched into his gait of the day the earth shook. They gave him soft buckskin clothing to replace the rags he had arrived in, clothes that felt warm and alive against his skin. He was no longer just an outsider being cared for. He was becoming part of the rhythm of their lives. He was Nathaniel, the boy who had shielded their grandfather. He was no longer invisible. Here, in this lodge, surrounded by these 7 brothers and their wise elder, he was seen, he was known. And for the first time in his life, the hollow space inside his chest began to fill with something other than loneliness. It was a strange, tentative warmth he did not dare to name. It felt, he thought, like belonging. The peace of his new life was fragile, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold river. He knew this, but he pushed the knowledge away, choosing to live in the warmth of the present. The threat, when it came, did not arrive as a whisper on the wind, but as a hard, arrogant voice that shattered the morning calm. It was a cold, bright day, the sun glinting off a light frost that silvered the prairie grass. Nathaniel was sitting outside the lodge, mending a piece of fishing net with a bone needle, a task Hotoa had been patiently teaching him. He moved with a new confidence, his body, though still aching, having regained much of its strength. He wore the buckskins and moccasins they had given him, his pale hair a stark contrast to the dark braids of the children he now played with. He heard the horses first, the heavy, shod tread of American mounts, so different from the light-footed, unshod ponies of the Cheyenne. A knot of ice formed in his stomach. He looked up to see a group of riders cresting the small hill that overlooked the camp. There were a dozen of them, armed with rifles, their faces grim and set. At their head was Garrett Vance, the blacksmith from Providence, a man whose cruelty was as hard and unyielding as the iron he hammered. Vance's eyes swept the camp, filled with a mixture of contempt and greed, before they landed on Nathaniel. The boy's heart hammered against his ribs. He saw the shock on Vance's face, followed by a dark, possessive fury. "There he is," Vance bellowed, his voice carrying across the quiet camp. "The savages took him, just like I said." Instantly, the camp came alive. The Cheyenne warriors did not panic, but moved with a fluid, disciplined grace. They emerged from their lodges, their expressions stern, their hands empty, but close to the weapons that were never far. Within seconds, the 7 brothers were there, forming a silent, unbroken line in front of Vokini's lodge, where the elder now stood with the aid of a staff. They placed Nathaniel behind them, shielding him with their bodies, just as he had shielded their grandfather. Moketavato stood at the center of the line, his arms crossed over his powerful chest. He was the picture of calm authority, his presence a bulwark against the intrusion. "We ain't here for a fight," Vance shouted, though his men held their rifles at the ready. "We're here for the boy. Hand him over, and we'll be on our way." Honyahaka stepped forward slightly, his role as translator clear. He spoke to Moketavato in Cheyenne, his voice low and rapid, then turned back to Vance. "He is not a prisoner," Honyahaka said, his English measured and cold. "He is a guest. He is healing." "Healing?" Vance laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Looks to me like he's gone native. Look at him, dressed in heathen rags. They've twisted his mind." He spurred his horse forward a few steps, his eyes locking on Nathaniel, who peeked from behind Akiseto's broad shoulder. "Boy, Nathaniel, you come with us now. We're here to save you." Nathaniel's blood ran cold. Save him? These men, who had looked through him his entire life, who had treated him as less than dirt, were now claiming to be his saviors. They wanted to drag him back to the cold lean-to, to the loneliness, to the invisibility. They wanted to rip him away from the only place he had ever felt warmth, the only people who had ever shown him true kindness. Fear warred with a new, unfamiliar feeling, anger, a hot, righteous anger that burned away the last vestiges of the timid, frightened boy he had been. He saw the situation for what it was, not a rescue, but an invasion, an assertion of power by men who believed their world was the only one that mattered. He made his choice. He stepped out from behind the brothers, his limp more pronounced under the stress, but his shoulders were straight, his chin high. He stood beside Moketavato, a pale, slender sapling next to a great oak, yet he did not waver. "I'm not going with you," Nathaniel said, his voice clearer and stronger than he had ever heard it. Vance's face purpled with rage. "What did you say, boy? Have they threatened you? Don't you worry, we'll handle these red-skinned devils." "They are not devils," Nathaniel shot back, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. "They saved my life." He took a breath, his eyes scanning the faces of the posse, men he had known his whole life. He saw their confusion, their ingrained prejudice warring with the undeniable sight of the boy standing freely before them. He looked directly at Vance. "I saw you that day," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping, becoming quiet and sharp as a shard of ice. "The day of the stampede. You were there, by the creek. You saw the elder fall." He let the words hang in the air. "You were the first to run." A wave of murmurs went through the posse. Vance's face went from purple to a mottled white. He had built his reputation in Providence on being a tough, fearless man. To be called a coward by an orphan boy in front of everyone was a blow he could not withstand. "You lie," Vance snarled, raising his rifle. "You ungrateful whelp, I'll—" He never finished the sentence. In a movement so fast it was a blur, Moketavato, Honyahaka, Wovoka, and all 7 brothers took one unified step forward. They did not draw weapons. They did not shout, they simply moved as one, a wall of silent, implacable intent. Their message was terrifyingly clear: "You will not touch him." The men behind Vance shifted uneasily on their horses. They had come for a simple retrieval, perhaps a show of force. They had not come to face 7 warriors defending one of their own, which, impossibly, the white boy now seemed to be. They had not come to die for Garrett Vance's bruised pride. They saw the truth in Nathaniel's words and the shame on Vance's face. One by one, the men lowered their rifles. One of them, a farmer named Amos, spoke up. "Garrett, maybe we should just go. The boy seems fine." Vance looked from the defiant face of Nathaniel to the stone-cold eyes of the 7 brothers, and he saw his authority crumble into dust. Defeated, his face a mask of pure hatred, he wrenched his horse's reins, turning it so violently the animal reared. Without another word, he galloped away, his posse trailing behind him, a disorganized and shamed retreat. Nathaniel watched them go, the dust of their departure settling back onto the quiet prairie. He stood his ground until they were nothing but a speck on the horizon. The tension slowly drained out of him, leaving him trembling, not with fear, but with the aftermath of a battle won. He felt a heavy hand land on his shoulder. It was Moketavato. The stern warrior looked down at him, and in his dark eyes, Nathaniel saw something profound: approval, pride. The camp slowly returned to its morning rhythm, but something fundamental had changed. The confrontation had solidified what had been quietly growing for months. Nathaniel had not just been saved by the Cheyenne. He had chosen them. He had defended them. He had stood with them as family. That evening, as the stars began to glitter in the vast, ink-black sky, Vokin called for him again. The 7 grandsons were there, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls of the lodge. The air was thick with ceremony. The old man looked at Nathaniel, his eyes filled with a deep, ancient wisdom. He spoke, and Honyahaka translated, his voice soft and reverent. "My grandfather says that an act of courage creates a debt. Your act saved his body. Our care for you has paid that debt. But today," Honyahaka's voice wavered with a hint of emotion, "today you did something more. You defended our honor. You spoke truth against a lie. You stood with us as one of our own. This creates not a debt, but a bond, a bond of the spirit. Vokin nodded slowly. He held up his hand, and one by one his grandsons stepped forward. Moketavato came first. He stood before Nathaniel and placed a hand on the boy's right shoulder. "I am Moketavato," he said, his own voice speaking the English words, slow and deliberate. "You are my brother now. I will be your shield." Then came Honyahaka. He placed his hand on Nathaniel's left shoulder. "I am Honyahaka. You are my brother. I will be your eyes." Wovoka followed, his hand gentle on Nathaniel's arm. "I am Wovoka. You are my brother. I will be your healer." One by one, they came forward, each placing a hand on him, a chain of connection, a living embrace of bone and muscle. "I am Akisito. You are my brother. I will be your strength." "I am Hotoa. You are my brother. I will be your hunter." "I am Tavehon. You are my brother. I will be your shelter." Finally, young Kohana stepped up, his face glowing with earnest devotion. He placed his hand over Nathaniel's heart. "I am Kohana. You are my brother. I will be your friend." 7 hands rested upon him, 7 solemn vows spoken into the sacred quiet of the lodge. 7 brothers, his brothers. Nathaniel stood in their midst, tears streaming freely down his face for the first time since he had become an orphan. They were not tears of sorrow or pain, but of a joy so profound, so overwhelming, it felt as if his heart, long a small, cold stone, had finally burst into flame. The orphan boy who was trampled by 10 buffalo had awakened to a life of pain and uncertainty. But he had healed, and in healing had found something more precious than his own survival. He was no longer Nathaniel Shaw, the stray scrap of Providence. He was brother to 7 warriors. He was the grandson of a wise elder. He was part of a family, forged not by blood, but by courage, honor, and a love as vast and enduring as the land itself. He was home. The year was 1876, and the land held its breath. It was a vast, lung-expanding emptiness of prairie that rolled away to a horizon so distant it seemed like the frayed edge of the world. Here, silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence of its own, thick and heavy like a blanket, broken only by the keening of the wind or the cry of a lone hawk painting circles on an immense, indifferent sky. In the center of this crushing quiet was Elias Vance and his small, defiant piece of earth. His cabin was little more than a tight-jointed box of sod and reclaimed timber, dug into the side of a low rise for protection against the relentless winds that scoured the plains. A stone chimney breathed a thin plume of smoke, the only sign of life for miles in any direction. Elias had built it all himself, one-handed. The left sleeve of his worn flannel shirt was pinned neatly at the shoulder, a constant, silent testament to the Battle of Antietam and the life he had left behind in a field of fire and blood-soaked corn. That war had taken more than his arm. It had taken the man he was supposed to be, a man with a wife and a future in the gentle, crowded hills of Pennsylvania. It had hollowed him out, leaving behind this hardened shell who now found a strange, bitter solace in the unforgiving landscape. The prairie demanded everything and offered nothing but space, and that suited Elias. Space was what he craved. Space from the pitying glances, the clumsy offers of help, the ghosts of comrades who still marched through his dreams. His days were a testament to grim routine. He rose before the sun bruised the eastern sky with color, his movements economical and practiced. He had learned to do with one hand what most men needed 2 for. He could split wood with a clever arrangement of wedges and a heavy maul, his one good arm corded with muscle from the repetitive strain. He could saddle his cantankerous old mare, pulling the cinch tight with his teeth and his right hand. He tended a small, struggling garden, coaxed life from the dry soil, and mended the fences that marked the paltry boundary of his world. Each task was a small victory against the phantom limb that ached with a cold he could never warm. Grief was a physical thing to Elias. It had weight and texture. It sat on his chest in the dead of night and walked beside him during the long, sun-bleached afternoons. He had come out here to lose himself, to be ground down into the dust until nothing remained but the work. But the memories were stubborn. He remembered the feeling of his wife Clara's hand in his left hand, the one that was now just a memory of flesh and bone scattered in the Maryland soil. He had stopped expecting peace. He settled for quiet. It was on a hot, breathless afternoon in late summer that the quiet was broken. He was checking a section of fence line near the creek bed, a dry, cracked ribbon of earth that only ran with water after the rare, violent thunderstorms. The air was still, heavy with the scent of dust and curing grama grass. Then he heard it, not the wind, not a coyote. It was a sound of animal distress, a frantic, desperate scrabbling accompanied by a low, pained whickering. Elias froze, his hand resting on a fence post. His first instinct was caution, a reflex honed by war and sharpened by solitude. Trouble came in many forms out here, and none of them were welcome. He scanned the terrain, his eyes narrowed against the glare. The sounds were coming from a narrow, rock-strewn arroyo just beyond his property line, a place where flash floods had carved a deep scar into the prairie. He stood there for a long minute, every part of him wanting to turn back to the familiar safety of his cabin, to pretend he had heard nothing. The world outside his fence was not his concern. He had made that pact with himself long ago. But the sound came again, sharper this time, a sound of pure panic. It scraped at something deep inside him, a dormant piece of the man he used to be. With a low curse directed at himself, at the world, at the intrusive sound, he ducked under the fence wire and began to walk toward the arroyo, his single hand resting on the handle of the hatchet tucked into his belt. As he neared the edge of the gully, he saw him, a boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old, his skin the color of burnished copper, his black hair long and unbound. He was Cheyenne, or perhaps Lakota. Elias couldn't tell for certain, and it hardly mattered. The boy was alone, his small frame taut with effort as he pulled on a rope tied to the head of a fine-looking pinto pony. The horse was well and truly stuck. Its hind leg had slipped between two large boulders at the bottom of the arroyo, trapping it in a cruel, unyielding vice. The animal's eyes were wide with terror, its coat slick with sweat and dust, the rocks around its trapped leg dark with blood. The boy didn't see Elias at first. His entire world was focused on the horse, his face a mask of fierce, desperate concentration. He was speaking to it in a low, crooning voice, the words soft and flowing in a language Elias did not understand, but the tone was universal. It was the sound of love trying to fight off fear. Elias stopped at the lip of the arroyo, a silent observer. He saw the raw, scraped skin on the boy's hands, the dust caked on his tear-streaked cheeks. He saw the futility of the effort. The horse was 1,000 pounds of panicked muscle, and the boy was just a boy. A part of Elias, the cynical, scarred part, told him to leave it. This was not his fight. Getting involved with the people was asking for a kind of trouble he was not equipped to handle. A lone white man, a boy from a tribe stories that began this way, rarely ended well. But then the boy's small shoulders slumped in a moment of utter defeat. He leaned his forehead against the horse's sweaty neck, and a single, heartbroken sob escaped him. That sound cut through Elias's armor like a hot knife. It was a sound of pure, helpless grief, a sound he knew all too well. He let out a long breath and slid down the dusty embankment, his boots dislodging a cascade of small stones. The boy's head snapped up, his eyes, dark and wide, fixed on Elias. Fear flashed across his face, instantly replaced by a guarded defiance. He straightened up, placing his body between Elias and the horse, a small, brave protector. He said nothing. His silence was as vast and watchful as the prairie itself. Elias stopped a few feet away, holding his one hand up, palm open. It was a gesture he hoped was universal. "Easy," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you. Or your horse." The boy's eyes flickered to Elias's pinned sleeve and then back to his face, his expression unreadable. He remained silent, a statue of wariness. Elias knew that words were mostly useless here. Action was the only language that might bridge the chasm between them. He slowly walked past the boy and crouched down to examine the trapped animal. The pinto flinched, its muscles quivering, but it was too exhausted and pained to struggle much. The situation was bad. The horse's leg was wedged tight, the flesh already swelling and torn. A simple pull would only do more damage, likely breaking the bone. He looked at the boulders. They were heavy, deeply set. He couldn't move them alone, not even with two good arms. He stood and surveyed the area, his mind, so long accustomed to solving the puzzles of solitary survival, beginning to work. He needed leverage. He looked back at the boy, who was watching his every move with an unnerving intensity. Elias pointed to a dead, sun-bleached cottonwood trunk lying half-buried in the sand 100 yards down the arroyo. It was thick and long. He made a prying motion with his hand, then pointed back at the rocks. For a moment, the boy just stared. Then, a flicker of understanding crossed his face. He gave a single, sharp nod. Together, they went to the log. It was heavy, awkward. For Elias, it was a brutal task. He had to heave and drag, his boots sinking into the soft dirt, his one arm burning with the strain. The boy, surprisingly strong for his size, pushed from the other end. They didn't speak. The only sounds were their ragged breaths and the grating of the wood against the rocky ground. It was a slow, agonizing process, a shared struggle that transcended language and suspicion. In that shared effort, a fragile, unspoken truce was formed. When they finally got the log into position, Elias scavenged for a smaller, flat rock to use as a fulcrum. He wedged one end of the log into the narrow space between the two boulders. This was the critical part. He would have to put his entire body weight onto the makeshift lever while simultaneously trying to guide the horse's leg free if the rock shifted. It was a dangerous, clumsy dance. He looked at the boy. He pointed to the horse's head, then made a gentle, soothing motion. He needed the boy to keep the animal as calm as possible. The boy seemed to understand immediately. He went to the pinto's head, murmuring those same soft words, his small hands stroking its neck and cheek, shielding its eyes from the sight of Elias's work. Elias took a deep breath, planting his feet firmly. He gripped the rough bark of the cottonwood, the splinters digging into his calloused palm. He threw all his weight onto the lever. The wood groaned in protest. The fulcrum rock shifted slightly. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep grinding sound, the larger boulder moved. It was only an inch, a sliver of space, but it was enough. "Now," Elias grunted, though he knew the boy wouldn't understand the word. The horse, feeling the release of pressure, instinctively scrambled, pulling its leg free with a final, desperate lurch. It stumbled, nearly falling, then stood trembling on 3 legs, its injured limb held uselessly off the ground. The leg was a mess, scraped raw and bleeding, already beginning to swell to an alarming size. Elias let the log fall with a heavy thud, his arm and back screaming in protest. He was breathing heavily, sweat stinging his eyes. The boy was at the horse's side in an instant, his hands running over the injured leg, his face a mixture of relief and anguish. The horse was free, but it was far from safe. An injury like that, left untended on the prairie, was a death sentence. Infection, or the inability to flee from predators, would claim it soon enough. Elias watched the boy, saw the dawning despair in his eyes as he realized the same thing. Elias sighed. He had already waded in this far, he might as well cross the river. "Come on," he said, more to himself than the boy. He gestured for the boy to follow, leading the way back toward his cabin. "It needs water, and that leg needs cleaning." The boy hesitated for only a second before he looped the rope loosely around the pinto's neck and began to coax the hobbling animal forward. The journey back to the cabin was slow and painful. The sun beat down, and the world seemed to hold its breath around them. When they finally reached the small corral next to Elias's barn, the horse was leaning heavily on the boy, its breathing shallow. Elias worked in silence, his movements efficient. He drew a bucket of cool, clean water from his well, holding it for the pinto to drink. The animal drank deeply, its thirst immense. Then Elias disappeared into his barn and returned with a wooden box containing his meager medical supplies, a bottle of carbolic acid, clean rags, and a jar of a foul-smelling salve he made from pine tar and herbs for his own animals. He approached the horse slowly. "Hold him steady," he told the boy, and this time the boy seemed to understand his intent. He held the pinto's head, murmuring to it constantly while Elias got to work. Cleaning the wound was an ugly business. Elias had to gently wash away the dirt and gravel, his touch surprisingly deft. The horse flinched and trembled, but, soothed by the boy's voice, it bore the treatment with a stoicism that matched its young master's. Elias tore a strip from a clean flour sack to fashion a crude bandage, soaking it in the antiseptic before wrapping it carefully around the swelling leg. It was not pretty, but it was clean. When he was finished, he stood up, wiping his hand on his trousers. "That's all I can do," he said quietly. "It needs rest. It can't travel far." He looked at the boy, who was staring at the bandaged leg. The boy then looked up at Elias, his dark eyes holding a depth of emotion that made Elias feel a strange pang in his chest. For the first time, the boy spoke to him, not in his own tongue, but in halting, carefully pronounced English. "You helped." Elias just nodded, feeling awkward. "Horse is a good horse. Shame to lose it." The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western clouds in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The boy knew he couldn't stay. He also knew he couldn't take the horse. He looked from his injured companion to the vast, darkening prairie, a silent conflict playing out on his young face. Elias understood. "It can stay here," he heard himself say, the words surprising even him. "In the corral, there's water, and I'll give it some hay. You come back for it when it can walk." The boy's gaze was searching, questioning. He was being offered a kindness he had no reason to expect, a trust that defied the hostility that so often defined the boundaries between their peoples. He looked at Elias, at his empty sleeve, at the weary lines etched around his eyes, and he saw something other than an enemy. He gave another of his solemn, decisive nods. He walked over to his pinto, laying a hand on its neck for a long moment and whispering something into its ear. Then he turned, gave Elias one last, long look, and without another word, set off on foot, a small, solitary figure quickly swallowed by the immense, gathering twilight. Elias watched him go until he was just a speck, and then nothing. He was alone again. He fed the injured pinto, the quiet movements of the chore, a comfort. But as night fell, the silence of his cabin felt different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with a profound and unsettling sense of anticipation. He had freed a horse for a native boy. Now he could only wait to see what the world would send back in return. Days bled into one another, each one a copy of the last, yet fundamentally changed. The profound isolation Elias had cultivated now felt like a vulnerability. Every morning he tended to the pinto's leg. The swelling began to subside, and the animal started putting a little weight on it. It was a good sign, but with each passing sunrise, the tension in Elias's gut twisted a little tighter. The boy had not returned. He found himself scanning the horizon constantly, his eyes searching for a lone, approaching figure. Instead, he saw only the heat haze shimmering above the endless grass. He told himself it was foolishness. The boy had likely found his people, told his story, and they had decided it was safer to abandon the horse than to risk further contact with a white man. Or maybe the boy couldn't find his way back. Maybe something had happened to him out on the unforgiving plains. The thought brought a surprising and unwelcome knot of concern. He began to talk to the pinto, filling the silence with his gruff, unused voice. "Well, looks like it's just you and me." He'd mutter while changing the bandage. "Your boy has more sense than I gave him credit for. Left you here and cut his losses." But he didn't believe it. He had seen the look in the boy's eyes. He would be back. The question was, who would be with him? Stories from the nearest town, a place he avoided whenever possible, were filled with fear and hatred. The army was fighting the Sioux and Cheyenne further north. Every settler saw a warrior in every shadow, a raid in every dust cloud. Elias had done an honorable thing by his own lights, but he knew that in the calculus of the frontier, his action could easily be misread. A stolen horse, a captured boy, the narrative could be twisted into something ugly and violent. His act of kindness could be seen as an offense, an intrusion that required a response. A week after the boy had left, the waiting ended. It was just after dawn. Elias was standing by the corral, watching the pinto take a few careful, limping steps. A sliver of movement on the northern ridge caught his eye. It was not one rider, but a line of them, silhouetted against the pale morning sky. He felt a cold dread wash over him. The line grew, spilling over the crest of the hill like a dark river. There were dozens, then scores, then hundreds. They were not a hunting party. They were warriors, moving with a fluid, disciplined grace that spoke of power and purpose. His heart hammered against his ribs. The stories, the fears, the ingrained caution of a soldierate all came rushing back. This was the response. He had been a fool, a sentimental old fool, to think his small act of kindness would be met with anything but suspicion and force. He backed away from the corral, his mind racing. There was no escape. His mare was fast, but not fast enough to outrun them, not with the head start they had. His cabin was sturdy, but it was a trap, a coffin of sod and wood. His rifle held a single shot, with 5 more cartridges in the box on the mantel, a meaningless gesture against such a force. The riders descended the slope and spread out, forming a vast, silent crescent that enclosed his homestead. Elias counted, his mind numb, and lost track after 200. There must have been double that. They were an overwhelming, breathtaking sight. Sunlight glinted off lances and rifle barrels. Their faces were painted, their presence radiating an immense, controlled power that made the very air vibrate. They stopped 100 yards from his cabin, a silent, intimidating wall of men and horses. Elias stood by his door, his one hand clenched into a fist at his side. The phantom limb ached with a ferocity he hadn't felt in years. He could run inside, bar the door, and die in the dark. Or he could face it. He thought of Antietam, of the pointless, brutal courage of men charging into certain death. He was done with that. He was not a soldier anymore. He was just a man on a piece of land who had helped a boy. With a resolve that felt less like bravery and more like pure, weary resignation, he did the one thing they would not expect. He did not raise his rifle. He did not run. He simply stood his ground, his face turned towards the sea of warriors, his empty sleeve, a stark declaration of all he had lost. He waited. From the center of the line, a single rider emerged. He was a man in his prime, powerfully built, his face a mask of stern authority. He wore a magnificent war bonnet of eagle feathers that trailed down his back, and he rode a powerful black warhorse that seemed to exude the same potent energy as its master. He rode forward slowly, with an unnerving confidence, his dark eyes fixed on Elias. He stopped 20 paces away. The silence was absolute. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath. Elias met the man's gaze, his own expression unyielding. He had faced death before. He would not show fear now. Then, from behind the formidable warrior, a second, smaller figure appeared, riding the pinto Elias had saved. It was the boy. The horse was still favoring its leg, but it walked steadily. The boy, whom Elias now knew in his heart, was named Chaitin Falcon, guided the horse to stand beside the chief, who Elias knew must be his father. Chaitin looked at Elias. There was no fear in his eyes. He pointed a small, steady hand toward Elias, then turned and spoke to his father in the flowing Lakota tongue. His voice was clear and carried in the stillness. He spoke for a long time, his words painting a picture that Elias could not understand but could feel. He gestured to the pinto's now healing leg, to the cabin, and finally he pointed to Elias's empty sleeve. When the boy finished, the chief, Tashunka, dismounted. He handed the reins of his horse to another warrior and began to walk toward Elias. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his eyes never leaving Elias's face. He was not walking as a warrior approaching an enemy, but as a leader assessing a man. Elias's hand, which had been clenched into a fist, slowly relaxed. He did not understand what was happening, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was not an attack. Tashunka stopped directly in front of him. He was taller than Elias, his presence immense. His gaze was intense, searching. He looked from Elias's face to the pinned sleeve, and his expression, which had been stern and unreadable, softened almost imperceptibly. He saw not just a white settler, an intruder. He saw a man who was also a veteran of a war, a man who bore the scars of his own battles. He saw the man his son had described, the one armed soldier who had fought to save a horse, who had shown kindness without asking for reward, and who had offered trust when he could have offered violence. The chief raised his hand, not in threat, but in the sign of respect. Then he spoke, his voice deep and resonant. An older warrior standing nearby translated, his English as solemn as the chief's tone. "I am Tashunka, chief of this band of the Lakota. This boy, Chaitan, is my only son." He paused, his eyes still locked with Elias's. "He told us of the horse trapped in the rocks. He told us a soldier with one arm fought the stones and freed him." Tashunka's gaze was heavy. "My son's horse is his spirit. You saved his spirit. You gave him water and medicine. You gave him shelter and asked for nothing. You are a man of honor." Elias was speechless. The 400 elite warriors surrounding his home were not an invasion force. They were an honor guard. They had come not to destroy him, but to recognize him. Tashunka turned and gestured. Two warriors came forward, carrying a heavy, folded buffalo robe, richly decorated with intricate quillwork. They laid it carefully on the ground before Elias. Another warrior led forward a magnificent bay gelding, strong and healthy, a clear replacement for the horse Elias might have claimed for his efforts. "This is a small gift for a great debt," the translator said. "You have shown you are not our enemy. This land will know you as a friend. My warriors will know this cabin. They will know the man with the quiet spirit. You will be safe here. No harm will come to you or your home. This is my word." Tashunka placed his hand over his heart for a moment, then turned without another word, mounted his warhorse, and looked out over his men. Chaitan gave Elias one final, grateful look before turning his pinto and falling in line beside his father. With a single, unspoken command, the entire force turned as one and began to ride away. They moved with the same silent, fluid discipline with which they had arrived, flowing back up the slope and over the ridge, disappearing as quickly as they had come. Elias stood there for a long time, the only sounds the whisper of the wind and the soft snort of the new horse beside him. The prairie was empty again, the immense silence flooding back in. But it was a different silence now. It was not the silence of isolation or loneliness, it was the silence of peace. He looked down at the magnificent robe at his feet, then at the strong, calm horse that stood waiting patiently. He was still a man alone on the prairie. He was still a man with one arm and a heart full of ghosts. But something had shifted. The crushing weight of his solitude had been lifted, not by the breaking of his isolation, but by the bridging of it. An act of simple kindness, offered without expectation, had been returned with an honor so profound it left him humbled. He slowly bent down and, with his one good hand, touched the soft fur of the buffalo robe. He looked out at the vast, empty horizon where the warriors had vanished. The land no longer felt like a place to hide from the world. It felt like home, and for the first time in a decade, Elias Vance felt a sense of peace settle over him, as wide and as quiet as the prairie sky.